And although I was not the principal speaker, I took my responsibility very seriously. I have never been one who can give a speech off the top of their head, so to speak. I very seldom come off very well when I attempt to do so. I prefer to take the time to select just that right word or phrase to say exactly what I mean to say. I had roughly 2 weeks to prepare my address, and while I was preparing it, I was thinking of the overwhelming number of casualties and the fact that they were all Americans, whether north or south. I was also very saddened and frustrated that even at this, the war was still not over. The first page was finished before I left Washington City. It is written on Executive Mansion stationery and in ink. I did rewrite the second page after I arrived in Gettysburg. It is written on foolscap paper and on pencil, in pencil. Now there's a story circulating that I wrote the address on the back of an envelope on the train going to Gettysburg. First of all, let me assure you that you cannot write anything on a moving train. I do admit that I did jot down some notes, which I often do when a word or phrase comes to mind and I want to remember to use them later, but I would have never left such an important speech to the last moment, as they say. Our train arrived at Gettysburg about dusk. Mr. Everett had already arrived earlier in the day. Judge Wills invited both Mr. Everett and myself to stay at his home, and of course we both accepted his most gracious invitation. Mrs. Wills prepared an excellent supper, and after we were serenaded by a group of citizens who prevailed upon me to give them a speech. I begged off, saying I had no speech to give them, and I needed to prepare for the ceremonies the following day. During the very early morning hours of November 19, 1863, a shower had dampened the grass and the dusty roads around Gettysburg, but about 8 o'clock in the morning the skies would begin to clear and the sun would shine in all of its autumn splendor. The parade was to step off about 10 o'clock in the morning, follow a route of approximately 1/2 mile. We went from Baltimore Street to the Emmitsburg Road, to the Tandytown Road, to the cemetery. Now there's a report that I rode a white horse, that I rode a black horse, that I rode a chestnut horse, that I rode a bay horse. I will simply assure you I rode a very spirited horse. We arrived at the cemetery at the platform around 11:30 in the morning.
Birchfield's band, sponsored by the Philadelphia Union League, opened the program with a grand funeral march. Next, Reverend Stockton gave the invocation, and the Marine Band played the hymn Old Hundred, also known as the doxology, Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Then Federal Marshal Ward Hill Lamon, serving as the Master of Ceremonies, introduced Mr. Everett. The audience listened intently as he spoke for 2 hours without notes, memorized a 2-hour-long speech, detailing the 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg, the desperate fighting at Seminary Ridge, Cemetery Ridge, Round Top, Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, and what has become known as Pickett's Charge. He also described the aftermath of those 3 days and the efforts of the citizens of Gettysburg to render assistance. He ended by invoking benediction on the honored graves of these martyr heroes. As he finished, exhausted, and returned to his chair, the Maryland Musical Association sang a dirge which had been composed especially for the occasion. Then Marshal Lamon introduced the President of the United States. Mr. Lincoln rose and stepped to the front of the platform to deliver a few appropriate remarks.
Fourscore years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. we have come to dedicate a portion of that field as the final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be here dedicated to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, and that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Reaction to the speech at the time was somewhat difficult to determine. In fact, there was a photographer in the audience that day setting up his equipment to take pictures of each of the speakers as they gave their addresses, and expecting each of them to speak for at least a couple of hours, which again was the custom at the time. Mr. Lincoln had stood up, given his speech, and sat back down again before the photographer had his equipment ready to go. And the audience around him, noticing his frustration, began to laugh and snicker a little. Well, Mr. Lincoln had not seen the photographer's predicament, but he did hear the laughter in the audience, and he may have thought that this was their reaction to what he had just said. In fact, he is reported to have commented, "The speech is a failure. The people are disappointed." Press reaction was also extremely mixed. The Chicago Times on November the 23rd, 1863 wrote, "The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dishwatery remarks of the President of the United States." But the Boston City Document said, "Perhaps nothing in the whole proceedings made so deep an impression on the vast assemblage, or conveyed to the country in so concise a form the lesson of the hour, as the remarks of the President." Perhaps the highest praise of all came from Edward Everett himself, who wrote to the President, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Abraham Lincoln had a reputation for being a very honest man, but he said something in the Gettysburg Address that turned out not to be true. He said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." And in fact, not many people can tell you very much of anything that Edward Everett said in 2 hours of a memorized speech. But the 2 minutes that Mr. Lincoln gave, what has become known as the Gettysburg Address, has become one of the best-known speeches in American history. It has even been called the speech that changed the Civil War and changed America.
After the Battle of Gettysburg, General Meade did not pursue General Lee as he retreated towards the Rappahannock River in the state of Virginia. He seemed content, as he put it, to drive the enemy from our soil. I replied, "General, it is all our soil." And even though I was urging him to catch up with Lee and destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, and even though this could have ended the war, he held back, giving Lee the opportunity to escape. As a result, the war would last almost 2 more years, and there would be countless more battlefields, there would be countless more casualties, and there would be more cemeteries, such as Gettysburg. Thank you.